Hello, AP Psychos. Question: how do you define intelligence? And are you intelligent? Something to ponder. I mean, would your definition be a standard one that everyone else here would agree with? I wonder, or do you have a different notion of what is smart? And more importantly, maybe, is who cares? Like, why do we care so much about having a number to measure our intelligence by and comparing ourselves with each other in terms of that? I mean, because like, does it really correlate with success or happiness? Not so much. And as we'll see, intelligence is one of the big controversial areas in psychology. Psychologists struggle to come up with a common definition themselves, although we do get close here. And also, yeah, why we obsess over why it matters so much. So anyway, we'll take on intelligence and psychometrics today. Remember, psychometrics, if you recall from our first unit, is one of the subfields of psychology that measures the psyche or makes tests. Um, so there's a variety of tests from personality tests and everything else, but we'll consider IQ tests today in the history of IQ testing. So we'll also ponder, like this guy, the poster child of genius, Einstein. What is genius for that matter? And why we try to be that. So here we go. First of all, to get us started here, what kind of smart are you? I mean, if we put you to it, which of these would you pick? Take a moment, decide which one defines you the most. One or two, maybe. Pause if you need to. These are multiple intelligences, and we'll pick up the theory here shortly, but I just wanted to see which one you would identify with the most. Traditionally in schools and such, we emphasize which ones. Of course, traditionally we emphasize verbal linguistic and logical mathematical. Word smart and logic smart. I mean, because these two slices of the pizza here are all about like what the SAT is trying to measure and such. By the way, let me make this really clear: the SAT is not an intelligence test. Let's be clear. So anyway, but yeah, the SAT is trying to measure this and this. And disregards a lot of these other things that may be perhaps more important for success and everything else. In any case, but the typical academic disciplines measure this too. But in psychology, of course, which other ones might we consider important for somebody who goes into, say, psychology? Um, at least in the counseling field and the clinical side. Well, you might want to say interpersonal, which is people smart, reading people and such. And then intrapersonal is like not interpersonal, but intra. That's self smart, like fathoming deeply into yourself and understanding deeply your emotional state and such, managing your emotional state and so on. A good sense of self analysis and introspection, I suppose. But there's also these others like musical smarts. Some people have an amazing ability to, remember sound and they respond to sound and that's their kind of smart. And then visual spatial, of course, if you're going to be an engineer or architect of various kinds, probably picture smart is going to be important for you. Bodily kinesthetic, that is that one as well. Some people can never have bowled in their life and they go to a bowling alley and they watch someone bowl and then they can go and imitate that person's body, perfectly, like the first time, perhaps. So bodily kinesthetic, of course, a good cerebellum might be important for that. If you remember, balance and coordination is one of the parts of the brain there. So, there's a different way of looking at what is smart, but let's look at this here. Defining intelligence, we were just looking at multiple intelligences, but let's go back in time where before they sort of started slicing it up like that, it was considered one general thing, intelligence, singular. And so we do have an argument here, and it's still one that is going on today between general and reasoning ability as intelligence as one singular thing versus the camp that thinks maybe there's different kinds of ways of being smart. And just because you're smart in one, like bodily, kinesthetic, or musical, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be smart in the other. And I have a feeling if I asked you which camp you would belong to, probably a lot of you, because you've grown up, in this generation, ever since the 90s, really, people have shifted more toward the multiple intelligences view. However, let me just say that there's a lot of clout on the general, yeah, I said that, on the general reasoning ability side. And here's why. So they call them, by the way, those on the general intelligence side, G factor theorists. One is a guy named Spearman. He spearheaded this whole thing, that it's one singular thing. G for general, okay? And so what they did is, now listen carefully, and I'm hoping this is going to sound familiar. They analyzed all these different kind of sub factors of smart people, right? Like they found that smarter people, what they think are smarter people, they tended to have a faster processing speed, right? So they thought faster. They had larger working capacity of working memory. They could hold more bits of information in their head. Remember, the standard is about 7 bits of information. They could hold like 12, 15, 20, I don't know. So perhaps more. They found perceptual organization, whatever that is, verbal comprehension. They found that like they had larger vocabularies, like so all these sub factors and stuff. And then when they tested them, they found that if they were high and strong in one, they tended to be high in the others also. So unlike multiple intelligences where you might be strong in bodily kinesthetic but not necessarily the others, in this case they found if one went up, the others tended to go up. Therefore, Spearman and others think that it's one general thing. And here's my question and why it should sound familiar. What method are we talking about here that they arrived at? You may recall in personality theory where we talked about they analyzed all these sub-traits and they found that they lined up under the big 5, the big ocean: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, etc. And then there's sub-traits underneath one. It's called factor analysis. That's Spearman. This was actually the first use of factor analysis, where people find clusters of related factors or sub-traits that go together. They're clustered together, and when they're strong in one, they're strong in the other. So that's through factor analysis. There's support for this general reasoning ability kind of intelligence. However, like I said, it's important to understand that some people are just really smart in one way and not in the others, and so there's definitely a lot of support for the multiple intelligences side. And if you're interested in that, Howard Gardner, he's still alive and kicking at Harvard. Howard Gardner is the guy that popularized multiple intelligences. He definitely has some problems with this theory, but we won't go into that, just as the general intelligence one does. So let's look at another one that actually, I got to tell you, this one makes a little more sense. This is Robert Sternberg's triarchic or triangular theory, because there's 3 points to it. He basically said there's 3 dimensions to what is intelligence. So he's kind of compromising a little bit. He does say there's kind of like multiple, at least 3 anyway, or at most 3. But if you're smart, you got to be kind of smart in maybe all 3 areas. But some people might be book smart, which is more analytical. They're real school smart. They're really like, they aren't street savvy, if you know what I mean. They don't have that kind of street smarts, which that would be more practicality, right? So down to earth. You're not necessarily book smart. You might not have even gone to school, but you're real street savvy, and you're just kind of like down to earth smarts, dealing with everyday real life problems, not theoretical stuff read in a book that's so abstract, which is also important. And then there's creativity. Creative intelligence is the ability to come up with new. Because these others, practical street smarts, and then book smart, kind of theoretical analytical stuff, those might be more typical convergent ways of thinking, but some people have the ability to diverge, and those are really hard to measure. It's really hard. I think we've mentioned this before. It's hard to measure creativity, because just as soon as you think you have a standard way of measuring this divergent thinking, you've just defeated the purpose of it, because it's about breaking away from the box. So divergent, new ideas, novel ideas, and such. In any case, Sternberg says, being smart might encompass all 3 of those. You might need all 3 at different times. A combination of any of these is uh, what he's looking at. But here, this is really important to keep in mind. There's something that's been talked about in recent decades, really, but definitely recently. It's called emotional intelligence. And it may be a greater predictor of success than anything we've talked about. Even, IQ, that is intelligence, or the multiple intelligences stuff. It seems that no matter, if you have a really high IQ, good for you. But if you don't have emotional intelligence, um, that might inhibit you in a lot of real life kind of situations. Emotional intelligence, or socio emotional intelligence, it's basically what we were looking at a moment ago: interpersonal and intrapersonal. The ability to read other uh, people problems, which is most problems in life, even if you're, somewhere else in an island, isolated. But you're a person too, so you're a person. Those kind of people problems. So intrapersonal, managing your own emotional state, self-discipline, and stuff like that, but also dealing with others and being empathetic to others is huge. And so they have found a lot of strong correlation with emotional intelligence and success in various fields, uh, more so than just a general IQ. In any case, but psychometrics, let's kind of take another look at measuring the mind. Now, we've already mentioned personality tests. If you recall, there were those self-report kind of assessments, like the Myers-Briggs and all that we talked about. And we talked about, if you recall, the most widely used personality test used by clinical psychologists was the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Inventory, which is a part of the diagnosis process for measuring personality type. And those were self-report kind of personality tests. Just a little review for you. And then there was the projective test, which is like things like the Inkblot or Rorschach test. And then the cards, where you tell stories, which were called the TAT, or thematic apperception. So yeah, we've mentioned that before, but let's move to the right side of the screen here and talk about more measuring like mental abilities. And cognitive tests measure thinking and mental abilities. So of course, an IQ test would fit there. So IQ tests would fall under cognitive abilities tests. So would other things like Mensa, if y'all are familiar with that, or the Kogat scores. Mensa is kind of a genius club or something out there. You have to pass their Mensa test to get into that. But anyway, so measuring your general reasoning abilities or your mental prowess, is all part of the cognitive abilities, and Kogat would kind of fit there too. There's also aptitude and achievement tests. I like to talk those side by side because one of those, aptitude or achievement, one of those tests is forward looking. It's trying to predict, whereas the other one is backwards looking. It's seeing if you have accomplished a certain degree of understanding or knowledge or skill. And so hopefully you can figure that out. Which one is future oriented and trying to predict the future? Aptitude tests. So aptitude tests are like tests you take to get into a program, or like an engineering school, or to get into college, of course, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, or the SAT. Now, obviously, you're going to have had some learning to be able to do that, but the purpose of the SAT, the A in SAT, is aptitude. It's trying to see if you have the aptitude to do college work in the future. If you're going to go to law school, you have to take the LSAT. If you're going to go to med school, to get in, to see if you have the aptitude to do medical field kind of stuff, you take the MCAT. But let's say you do go to law school. After law school, then it's backwards looking. They want to see if you've achieved a certain level of understanding about law in Texas or something, let's say. So you have to take the bar exam, and that would be an achievement test. A final exam in a history class would be an achievement test. So there you go. So differences between some of these different tests. Let me ask you this. The AP exam that you're going to take in the spring for AP Psychology, is that an aptitude test or an achievement test? Answer: that is an achievement test. They're trying to see if you've achieved a certain level of understanding about introductory psychology. They're not trying to see if you have aptitude for going into psychology necessarily. So that's not the purpose of it anyway. All right. So if you guys have had awful experiences probably like this, where you're crammed into a room and they time you, and nightmares. Actually, we don't see much of that these days in a pandemic situation. But so what we want to talk about here is, when you're taking these tests, what makes a crappy test from a good test? So there's three criteria you need for a test to be a good test. And if you've had bad tests where you're like, what? This is not even fair. That's a legit concern, and it may have violated one of these three criteria. So what are the three criteria for constructing a good test? Let's start with standardization. Standardization means like this person here and this person over here and this person here, they're taking the same test. They're timed the same. It's not like one can use a calculator and the other one can't. It's not like one gets extra time and the other one doesn't. If it's standardized, it's standard. It's universally applied or administered, uniformly administered, so everybody's doing it the same way, the same timing, and so on. And it's fairly administered that way because it's uniform. So if you're in New Jersey and you're taking the SAT, it should be the same as if you're in California and taking the SAT. It's standardized. It's also normed. That's part of the standardization. It's normed. In other words, they've established a norm for how you do compared to others. What is the norm or the average or mean of how all those people in that room do? And hopefully you're not normal in this case. You're above the norm. So part of the standardization process is establishing the norm or norming. So that's one criterion. Another one would be validity. So is the test valid? You know what? I think I missed something. Let's talk about, before I go further, let me double check this. Yeah, okay, sorry. We need to talk about this. Just as a little review here, I was talking about norming in terms of standardization. Well, let's look at this old normal curve, the bell curve that we love so much in psychology. Certainly that's something of interest to psychometrics. Of course, the average or norm is where? The average or norm on any bell curve is going to be right there in the middle because that's the hump. That's most people. Whereas you got these freaks over here, these elite or whatever, depends on what we're measuring. And then these freaks over here, extreme cases of high and low. And hopefully you guys may remember what these percentages mean here. I hope you do. These are patterns of variation that go this way and patterns of variation that go to either side of the average or mean. And that is called standard deviation. So if you recall from Unit 1, standard deviation is this pattern of deviation away from the average. And remember, it's no matter what you're talking about, whether it's shoe size or height or weight or IQ of the population, one standard deviation to each side is always 68% of the population. That is 34% to each side. 95% is always from -2 up to +2 standard deviations and so forth. So I just wanted to review that for you real quick. Now, let's go to reliability, the second criteria. So let's talk about reliability before validity. So reliability is the test consistent over time? So, if you take the Myers-Briggs. Remember the Myers-Briggs personality test? A lot of you had taken it and gotten those your four-letter combination like ENFP or IS and whatever. And you may have had it before. Did your letters come out the same? And if you took it in 6 more months, would you come out the same? In which case, with test-retest, it's coming out pretty consistently. That's your personality type. And it is, but sometimes those letters flip and you change, particularly in adolescence. But reliability, is it consistent over time? Another way of testing the consistency of the test is not just over time, it's split half scoring, which is basically taking half the test and then seeing how that score turns out and comparing it to another portion of the test, and those should be about the same, just to test if it's consistent within its own construction, if that makes sense. In any case, but the third criterion, this is important, it's validity. So as we said, there's standardization, there's reliability, and now validity. So validity is, does a test do what it's supposed to? Does it serve its purpose? Is the test serving its purpose? So take a look at this SAT question real quick. Read it and decide what you think the right answer is. Well, is there anything wrong with that question? This question was thrown out, thankfully, because it is not a good question. There's a number of problems with it. One is, back to our point here, what is the purpose of the SAT? What is its function? What is it supposed to do? And that A in SAT, it's supposed to see if you have the aptitude for in the future to do college academic work. Does that question really assess that, So that is if you've ever had a question where, like, let's say it's in a history class and you get some weird question that's like has nothing to do with history and like maybe nothing the teacher said or whatever, you might say that's not a valid test of my understanding of post Civil War Reconstruction history or something, and it's not a valid content in that case. So there's content validity, like the content of the test, the stuff in the test is not serving the purpose of what the test is supposed to do. And then there's predictive validity. It's sometimes called criterion related, but I don't see it called that much anymore. Predictive validity means it's serving its purpose, and in order to figure out if it's serving its purpose, if it's predictively valid, is you look at something other than the test score, some other criterion. So that's why it's called that. So in other words, let's say the SAT. The SAT's purpose is to predict if you have ability to do college work. Well, how would they know that? One way they would look at is other criterion. So they might, once you get into college, look at your GPA in college and then go back and pull out your SAT scores and compare the two. And you're like, yep, these people scored higher on SAT and their GPAs are higher than these people over here. So that's predictive validity. So there's different ways of assessing. Does the test what it's supposed to test, which is validity. So yeah, three things about a test that needs to make it a good test is standardization, reliability, and validity. So now, the thing is, you guys are over tested. Everything's test, and I feel for you. That's awful. It's too bad that we've come to that, and we'll later we might consider, what would happen if you just took grades away? Would it be more intrinsically motivating to go to school and just learn for its own sake? So yeah, I do understand. In any case, let's talk about the history of this obsession for testing, particularly with IQ tests. So the history of testing and IQ tests, where did it start? Well, the very first, and this is kind of famous, so this might be a good trivia question, and certainly something you want to know in psychology. The very first IQ test in modern history was the Stanford-Binet. So the Stanford-Binet IQ test now is developed by a guy named Alfred Binet, who was French, and he was trying to test children to see where in school they would be best served. So a placement in Parisian schools. And he warned, he's like, that's all we need to use this for. We don't need to use this as some way of measuring society in all these ways. And he was right about that. But when we Americans got a hold of this test, we went freaking crazy over IQ testing. In fact, let me just say that it was some guys at Stanford University, and thus the name Stanford-Binet IQ test. They got a hold of Binet's test, and they added some things and tweaked it and Americanized it somewhat. So the Stanford-Binet IQ test, they're one of the first widespread uses in the United States of the Stanford-Binet IQ test was testing World War I soldiers, enlistees, to see where to put them. In other words, if you scored low on the Stanford-Binet test, they're going to send you to the front lines and you're going to be in a ditch shooting, and Germans shooting at you and stuff. If you scored high, maybe you get a nice cushy tent and you can decode secret messages or something. But anyway, Louis Terman's one of the guys that was a part of the American group that helped develop this test. And he looked at things like, he dispelled some myths. One is that the notion that people with high IQs are nerdy and like, pocket protectors and tape on the glasses and runny nose all the time and carrying around their biology report, in a suitcase at school. Turns out that is not typically the case. That Terman found that in many of the children he was assessing and followed in his studies were larger in stature, taller. They tended to be more athletic, physically healthier than the average IQ. So that was the case for, a little bit above average. After a while, though, you do find in the extreme cases there's some social awkwardness with exceptionally high IQs sometimes. Is it correlated with success? Not all the time, really. So that again is another thing. It seems that it's not correlated with some of the things that you need to be successful in different careers. Creativity, for example. As IQ goes up, creativity goes up for a little bit, correlated to it. Then as IQ continues to climb, creativity starts to drop as IQ continues to climb. So, And maybe that's because IQ kind of thinking is in the box. You're answering the questions correctly on a convergent IQ test to score high, whereas creativity is hard to measure and it's about breaking the system. So yeah, not something that's measurable by an IQ test of this kind anyway. Now this is important because there were flaws with the Stanford Binet. But before I go to the Wechsler test, let me just talk about the flaws. One flaw is that they found that the Stanford Binet test was overly verbal. It's wordy, and if English is not your first language, that's a problem. And if words aren't your thing, language you have trouble, I'm dyslexic, so that would be a problem, then it's not going to catch that. So that's one thing. It's overly verbal, wordy. There was also some problems, and I don't have a way of showing you this right now because I don't have a dry erase board, but you need to know the formula for IQ. The formula for IQ is mental age, at least according to the Stanford Binet test, mental age divided by chronological age times 100. So here we go. That there. IQ is mental age divided by chronological age times 100. So in other words, the bottom number, the chronological age, is your actual physical age. So if they're testing somebody, one of you guys, and let's say you're 17, that's the bottom number, your chronological age. Well, how do we get the mental age? Of course, we give you the Stanford Binet test. So your mental age turns out to be, well, let's say if you're an average person, that's 17. 17 divided by 17 is 1 times 100, 100. So the average IQ is 100. Now, you guys, you're smarter than average, I suspect, according to this. And so therefore, maybe you are 17, that's the bottom number, but maybe you score mentally at the age of a 22-year-old. And so do the math. So that would score you higher. That's the problem is that works when you're maybe in childhood. Like if you test an 8-year-old, chronological age of 8, compared to a 10-year-old, oh, you got the mental age of a 10-year-old, even though you're only 8. That works for children. But what if you're 30 and you score at the level of a 32-year-old or a 35-year-old? Well, it doesn't make sense there. So in terms of aging, it becomes a problem too with that formula. So with that, they came up with this one. And the reason we need to know this is because the Wechsler test is the most widely used intelligence test today. So IQ testing, they don't really use the Stanford Binet much anymore. Wechsler test is used more often. The one for adults is called the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, or WAIS. The one for children is called the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. What's important here to note, they're trying to fix the problems. One is that formula problem. So they create a different kind of test for children and different age groups, as well as adults. The other problem they're trying to fix is and the guy who did that was a guy named David Wechsler, thus the name, the Wechsler test, or whatever. The other thing he's trying to fix is that overly verbal. Well, it's hard to get around verbal problems. So they keep the words and they keep that verbal portion of the IQ test, but they add a performance scale, a performance section. And it's more hands-on kind of stuff. So in the case of the children one, look in the images there to the left, and you see it's like puzzle completion. It's purely visual. Like they'll time you as you try to recreate that same geometric design, or with particularly younger kids, you have to put the body together. If you put the arm, where the face should be, that's a problem. In any case, or what's missing. So a lot of visual kind of things like that in case there's language barriers or such. So more hands-on performance. And this is important, David Wechsler also added the normal curve. So here we have the development of the normal curve and added to IQ, the bell curve. So Wechsler test uses this a lot. And as I said, 17-year-olds who score at the level of a 17-year-old are going to end up with the average IQ of 100. So now, remember every 34% plus 34, that's 68. So within one standard deviation to each side of the average, which is 100, you get a standard deviation. That turns out to be, once you plug in the formula, that every 15 IQ points is a standard deviation this way, and every 15 IQ points this way is a standard deviation. So the reason that's important here is because 2 standard deviations below the average IQ is 70. 2 standard deviations above the average IQ is 130. Why do we care? Because they made that the demarcation for intellectually disabled, what used to be called mentally retarded. So 70 and below is intellectually disabled. Forrest Gump was right about there, by the way. And 130 and above, that is the demarcation for not genius, giftedness, a different G word. So intellectually gifted. So 130 and above. Stewie, I guess, is right about there. I don't know. He's a smart kid. So, is intelligence nature or nurture? That's a good question to ask. Is it something we biologically get from our parents, or is it something that good schools and good parenting, nurture us to have? Well, it turns out to be a little both. But let's talk about the twin studies first. On the nature side, if you recall, monozygotic as opposed to dizygotic twins. Monozygotic twins are the kind of twins that are genetically identical, and then in the studies they used, they found that there were genetically identical monozygotic twins that grew up in different families. They were put up for adoption, and so they have different environments that they grew up in, and they brought them all back in and did a barrage of tests, including personality tests and IQ tests. Turns out these kids had the same IQs in many cases, same personalities, all these, you're like, man, there's some serious genetics going on here. So yeah, it seems like with twin studies, it supports that there's a strong genetic nature predisposition for how smart you are. Thanks, Mom and Dad. But there's no denying that a powerful environment can improve or work the other way. Let's talk about nurture. So cumulative deprivation and Flynn effect both apply to the environment side. A good environment, let's start with the Flynn effect first then. The Flynn effect, basically with each generation in a good environment with good schools and the society that's concerned about developing children's intelligence and such, they're going to go up. So if you took a time machine back in time and gave your parents the same IQ test that you're taking also now, and they're the same age, don't kiss your mother at the high school dance, by the way, Back to the Future kind of problem. In any case, you'll probably find that you'll outscore your parents, because with each generation, that's the way we're moving. So unless there's a zombie apocalypse, in which case, yeah, we're going to go, so the Flynn effect is basically the improvement from generation to generation in IQ in a good environment that's nurturing. Cumulative deprivation is basically the opposite. So in an impoverished environment, war-torn countries, or where they're refugee situations and they're uprooted by drought or famine, those kind of, or they're in Alabama. No, I'm just kidding. Sorry, I was totally. Anyway, so cumulative deprivation, they find that with each generation it spills over even after they've recovered from that famine or drought or pandemic. They find that it kind of might spill over and linger another generation or two. It's kind of becomes, sometimes they call this the epigenetic effect, EPI genetic. So epigenetic effect is where what was nurture, it's like an environmental thing like war or whatever, might sort of become part of the genetic makeup for a while, and so it's hard to separate nature and nurture. There's gray areas there. In any case, moving on. So it's a little of both. Finally, one last topic here. What is genius? Again, not giftedness. That was IQ 130 and above. But we use this word genius loosely, and what is it exactly? And again, it may have to do with more than just being having IQ. We often think that's the first thing. You think of Einstein, and I don't know what his IQ was, but incredibly high on the IQ scale. But people often talk about, the thing about Einstein is not, high IQ, but he was exceptionally creative. So what Sternberg talked about, that creative intelligence, he came up with something entirely out of the box and new that nobody had thought of before. So there's definitely the creative intelligence. He's obviously got the analytical intelligence, which is what we usually mean by that. Is it applicable? Well, his theories are applicable. So it's got the practical intelligence too. So in any case, they have studied people who are exceptionally creative and movers and shakers in whatever their field, like Einstein or Picasso or whoever, so a variety of different fields, not just analytical kinds. And they found that there's 4 basic things. they find that they tend to be very intrinsically motivated by what they're doing. And you could put it this way: they're obsessed with whatever they are. They will skip meals and everything because they're so obsessed with what they're doing. Remember, intrinsic motivation is you do it for its own sake, not for fame or money or anything. They also talk about deliberate practice. Because they're obsessed with it, they improve, and they acknowledge they fail. Failure is not something they're afraid of. In fact, failing faster is a term you sometimes hear. Do it as fast as you can and fail, and then learn from your mistakes and use deliberate practice. And they talk about this 10,000 hour rule or 10-year rule. They find that when Hamlet gets written and Macbeth, which was the same year, by Shakespeare, for example, I give a lot of examples through history, when the golden age of a certain artist or scientist is finally there, you look at it, it's about 10 years of obsessive, deliberate practice in whatever field that was. With some exceptions, but it's kind of interesting that they've gotten to that point. So about 10 years. So don't expect to write your Nobel winning whatever it is you're going to do right out of college. All right. So, you have a little patience, be obsessed, and deliberately practice and fail as fast as you can. They also have this drive or sense of purpose. And finally, one last thing, and this has been talked about a lot in psychology lately. It's called the growth mindset, work by Carol Dweck, Weck. Dweck is sometimes referred to as a positive psychologist. She studies happiness, flourishing, and such. With growth mindset, they find, as opposed to a fixed mindset, they find that they're the kind of people who think that they can grow, they can develop in different ways, and you're not born stupid in that area. Like if you're not good at math, you're like, well, I'm just genetically not wired to do math. Well, that they don't believe that would be a fixed mindset. They would say that if you work at it, you can improve it. And so they find that these people tended to have a growth mindset and not this fixed mindset that many of us often have. So there you go, folks. That is psychometrics and intelligence, and we'll talk more about the controversies of intelligence and testing coming up.